Hello, everyone. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in someone else's shadow, my younger sister Hannah's. I'm Leah, 34, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand why our parents seemed to see her as the golden child. Hannah, now 32, excelled at everything from a young age. She was beautiful, outgoing, and effortlessly charming. She breezed through school as a top student, won every competition she entered, and became the center of attention at every family gathering. By the time she was in high school, she was a cheerleader, class president, and valedictorian. My parents couldn't have been prouder. Meanwhile, I struggled to find my place. I was the quieter one, the bookworm who spent her days dreaming of coding and creating instead of cheerleading and competing. I wasn't unattractive, but I'd inherited a stockier build from our dad, unlike Hannah, who was slim and model-like. Mom constantly signed me up for fitness classes I didn't want and diets I didn't ask for, often comparing me to Hannah. "You could look just as nice as her if you put in a little effort," she'd say, as if I wasn't already trying in my own way. The favoritism wasn't always glaring, but it was consistent enough to leave its mark. My parents celebrated Hannah's achievements with parties and praise, while my milestones barely registered. When I graduated with a degree in computer science, they said a quick, "good job," and moved on, already planning a celebration for Hannah's latest modeling gig. When she landed a prestigious corporate job straight out of college, they threw a party complete with a catered dinner and a toast. By contrast, I'd learned to stop seeking their approval. By my mid-20s, I decided to focus on myself. I advanced in my career as a software developer, made genuine friendships, and built a life on my own terms. The surface-level interactions I maintained with my parents sufficed to keep the peace, though each holiday dinner reminded me how little they cared about who I'd become. They still gushed over Hannah's promotions, boyfriends, and vacations, while I quietly listened and nodded. Then I met Ethan. Ethan saw me for who I was from the start. He appreciated my dry humor, my love for problem-solving, and even my body, which I'd spent years resenting. He never compared me to anyone else or suggested I change. After 4 years together, he proposed in the simplest, most thoughtful way: over takeout and a movie at home. It was perfect. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone truly valued me for who I was, even if my family never did. Telling my parents about the engagement was nerve-wracking, but I wanted to believe they'd be happy for me. Instead, their reaction was underwhelming. Mom paused, then asked if I was sure I wanted to rush into this. She even suggested I might want to lose weight before the wedding. Dad barely said anything at all. It stung, but I tried to push it aside, focusing on planning a day that would celebrate Ethan and me. Planning my wedding should have been one of the happiest times of my life, but it turned into a bittersweet experience. From the start, my parents showed little interest. While Ethan's family enthusiastically offered help with everything from flowers to the seating chart, my parents acted indifferent. Even after I sent them invitations, both physical and electronic, they didn't RSVP. When I followed up, they gave vague excuses about needing to check their schedules. Hannah, unsurprisingly, was even less supportive. She didn't respond to the invitation or acknowledge my engagement in any way. I tried to brush it off, telling myself she was busy with work, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The few times my mom did weigh in on wedding details, her comments were far from encouraging. When I found my dream dress, a simple yet elegant A-line gown, she remarked that it was practical and suited my figure. It wasn't the glowing approval I'd hoped for, but by then, I was used to her backhanded compliments. Thankfully, Ethan's family stepped up. His mother treated me like the daughter she never had, helping me choose the venue, plan the menu, and even organize a beautiful bridal shower. It was a stark contrast to my own family's disinterest. On the day of the shower, the absence of my mom and sister was glaring, but Ethan's family made sure I felt loved and supported. As the wedding day approached, I held onto a sliver of hope that my parents might surprise me by showing up. But when the day came, their seats in the front row remained empty. During the ceremony, I tried to focus on the love I shared with Ethan, but it was impossible not to notice their absence. The father-daughter dance I dreamed of never happened, and every glance at those empty chairs felt like a dagger to the heart. Despite this, the day was beautiful. Ethan and I exchanged vows in a stunning garden ceremony surrounded by friends and family who truly cared about us. His father stepped in for the traditional dance, turning what could have been a painful moment into a touching memory. By the end of the night, I was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who had shown up to celebrate our love, but the hurt lingered. After the honeymoon, I decided to confront my parents. When I finally reached them, they claimed they hadn't attended because they never received an invitation. I knew this wasn't true. I had delivery confirmations for both the physical and electronic invites. When I pointed this out, they became defensive, accusing me of trying to make them look bad. It was a painful conversation that ended without resolution. Ethan later revealed something he'd overheard at our engagement party that put their behavior into perspective. Apparently, my parents had spent most of the evening on the phone with Hannah, who was upset that I was getting married first. According to Ethan, they'd said things like, "This wasn't the plan," and "We never expected Leah to marry before Hannah." Hearing this confirmed what I'd always suspected. My parents couldn't handle the idea of me stepping out of the role they'd assigned me, the overlooked, less successful daughter. In the weeks after my wedding, the repercussions of my parents' actions began to ripple through our extended family. Word of their absence spread, and naturally, relatives wanted to know why they hadn't attended. I didn't go out of my way to share the details, but I also didn't sugarcoat the truth. When asked, I explained simply, they chose not to come because they couldn't accept me getting married before Hannah. Apparently, this straightforward honesty struck a nerve. Several family members, especially those who had attended my wedding, expressed their disappointment in my parents' behavior. Some even began to pull away from them, refusing to engage in the usual small talk at gatherings or declining invitations to future events. It was as if my parents' favoritism, which they'd managed to keep mostly behind closed doors, was finally exposed. Hannah, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. Or perhaps she chose to ignore it. She continued to plan her lavish wedding, with my parents enthusiastically supporting her every step of the way. They sent updates to the family group chat, complete with pictures of venue tours, dress fittings, and menu tastings. It was hard not to feel a pang of jealousy, not for the wedding itself, but for the clear display of love and attention I'd never received. Then, the unexpected happened. Family members started declining Hannah's wedding invitations. At first, it was just a few cousins citing scheduling conflicts, but soon, even close relatives began to back out. The reason? Many were still upset over how my parents had treated me. If they can't show up for one daughter's wedding, why should we show up for the other? One aunt reportedly told my mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' attempt to elevate Hannah had backfired spectacularly. Hannah wasn't pleased. She reached out to me, not with an olive branch, but with accusations. She blamed me for turning the family against her, claiming I was spreading lies about our parents to make them look bad. Her messages were laced with condescension, as if she expected me to apologize for the rift she believed I'd caused. I didn't respond. Years of dealing with her manipulative tactics had taught me that silence was often the best defense. But Hannah wasn't done. When she couldn't get a reaction from me, she turned to Ethan. Somehow she found his personal number and sent him a series of messages that ranged from patronizing to outright absurd. She suggested that as my husband, it was his responsibility to help me see reason and repair my relationship with our parents. She even hinted that maintaining good family ties could be beneficial for his career, a thinly veiled attempt to leverage her own professional success. Ethan, to his credit, found the whole thing laughable. He showed me the messages, and we spent the evening reading them aloud in mock-serious tones, turning her melodrama into a source of humor. His reply to her was simple and perfect. "Thank you for your concern, but Leah and I are focused on building our life together. If you have any issues, please take them up with her directly." Hannah's response? Silence. For once, she seemed to realize that her usual strategies wouldn't work on Ethan, but the damage had already been done, not to me, but to her own image. The more she and my parents tried to control the narrative, the more they alienated themselves from the family. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't need to fight back. The truth was doing all the work for me. As the drama unfolded, the cracks in our family's carefully constructed facade became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the immediate fallout from my parents' behavior at my wedding. It was the years of pent-up frustration among relatives finally boiling over. They'd had enough of the favoritism, the manipulation, and the toxic dynamics that had been swept under the rug for so long. The tipping point came when my parents began reaching out to relatives individually, trying to salvage Hannah's wedding plans. Their messages were a mix of desperate pleas and subtle accusations, painting me as the villain who had turned the family against them. But instead of rallying support, these efforts backfired spectacularly. Aunt Clara, one of the few relatives who had always managed to stay neutral, called me unexpectedly one evening. "Leah?" she began, her voice tinged with a mix of warmth and weariness. "I just wanted to tell you something. It's about time someone stood up to them. I've watched this dynamic for years, and honestly, I wish I'd spoken up sooner." Her words struck a chord. For so long, I had felt isolated in my experiences, as though I was the only one who saw the blatant favoritism. Hearing someone validate my feelings was both comforting and disorienting. It was as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. In the following weeks, more relatives started to share their stories. An uncle recounted how my parents had constantly steered conversations at family gatherings to highlight Hannah's achievements, often at the expense of others. A cousin confessed that my mom had once pressured her to give Hannah a professional opportunity, even though she wasn't qualified. These revelations weren't entirely surprising, but they painted a clearer picture of just how far my parents had gone to prop up Hannah's image. Hannah, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. She sent me another scathing message, accusing me of poisoning the family against her. "You've always been jealous of me," she wrote. "It's not my fault that I've worked hard and made something of myself. Maybe if you weren't so bitter, you'd understand that Mom and Dad are proud of me for a reason." Her words hurt, though not in the way she might have intended. They didn't sting because I believed them, but because they revealed how deeply she had internalized the favoritism. In her mind, she truly believed she was entitled to our parents' adoration, and any challenge to that dynamic was an act of bitterness or spite. It was clear she didn't see herself as part of the problem, only as its victim now that things weren't going her way. Through it all, Ethan remained my anchor. "You've done nothing wrong," he reminded me one evening as we sat together on the porch. "If they're upset, it's because the truth is finally catching up with them. That's not on you." His words were a lifeline. In the face of relentless guilt-tripping and gaslighting, it was easy to second-guess myself. But Ethan's unwavering support helped me stay grounded. I wasn't the cause of this chaos. I was simply the first person in the family to stop playing along. As the date of Hannah's wedding approached, the divide within the family became more pronounced. Relatives who had initially remained on the fence began to take a stand, refusing to attend the event despite my parents' increasingly frantic pleas. Some even forwarded me the messages my parents had sent, which were filled with thinly veiled accusations and melodramatic appeals for unity. One email stood out in particular. It was a lengthy diatribe from my mom, sent to nearly the entire family, blaming me for the unnecessary drama and accusing me of trying to sabotage Hannah's big day out of jealousy. "We've done everything we could to love and support both our daughters equally," she wrote, conveniently ignoring decades of evidence to the contrary. "It breaks our hearts to see Leah turn her back on us like this." The irony was almost laughable. My parents had spent years disregarding my feelings, and now they were positioning themselves as the victims of my supposed betrayal. But their narrative wasn't landing the way they hoped. Relatives who had once been staunch supporters were now openly questioning their behavior, and some even reached out to me with apologies. "I should have spoken up sooner," one cousin admitted during a phone call. "We all saw how they treated you, but it was easier to just go along with it. I'm sorry for not being there for you before." These conversations were bittersweet. On one hand, it was validating to hear that others had noticed the favoritism and sympathized with my struggles. On the other hand, it was painful to realize how long I had been left to navigate this dynamic alone. The final straw came a week before the wedding, when my parents sent out a mass email announcing that they had to change the venue due to unexpected conflicts. It didn't take much digging to uncover the truth. The family friend who owned the original venue had withdrawn their support after hearing about my parents' treatment of me. The same went for the boutique supplying Hannah's custom dress, which suddenly had scheduling issues. Hannah was livid, and she made no effort to hide it. "This is all your fault," she texted me in a final attempt to guilt-trip me into submission. "You've ruined everything because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention." For once, I didn't feel the need to respond. Her words, like her attempts to manipulate Ethan, held no power over me anymore. Instead, I focused on the life I was building with Ethan, a life free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with my family for so long. The closer Hannah's wedding day came, the more I realized that I had already won. Not in the petty competitive sense she seemed to believe, but in the sense that I had finally freed myself from their influence. Their approval no longer dictated my self-worth, and their absence no longer felt like a loss. The fallout from my parents' actions was theirs to deal with, not mine. For the first time, I felt truly at peace. As Hannah's wedding drew closer, the fractures in our family's dynamics widened into chasms. My parents, desperate to preserve the image they'd carefully curated, became more erratic in their attempts to pull the family back into their corner. They bombarded relatives with emotional appeals, blaming me for the growing tension and painting Hannah as a victim of jealousy and spite. One email from my mom, forwarded to me by a cousin, laid their desperation bare. "It's heartbreaking to see Leah create division in our family," she wrote, "especially when we've done everything to support her. Please don't let her bitterness ruin Hannah's special day. She deserves to have the family come together to celebrate her achievements." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. For years, I had been overlooked, dismissed, and sidelined, yet now I was being cast as the villain for finally standing up for myself. Despite their efforts, the tide wasn't turning in their favor. Relatives who had once been passive began to distance themselves from my parents. Some openly refused to attend Hannah's wedding, while others withdrew their support more subtly by suddenly becoming too busy to participate in planning or events. Even close family friends who had been fixtures at every major gathering started to take a step back. It wasn't just about my parents' behavior at my wedding. It was the years of favoritism and manipulation that had finally caught up with them. Relatives began sharing their own grievances in hushed conversations and group chats, recounting instances where they, too, had felt pushed aside or used to bolster Hannah's image. What had once been dismissed as harmless favoritism was now being called out for what it truly was, a toxic pattern that had hurt more than just me. Hannah, of course, was furious. She blamed me entirely for the fallout, sending another series of messages that veered between accusatory and self-pitying. "You've always been jealous of me," one read. "It's not my fault Mom and Dad are proud of me. You're just trying to bring me down because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention." The messages didn't sting the way they once might have. Instead, they felt hollow, like echoes of a script she'd been reciting her entire life. Her attempts to guilt-trip me only highlighted the fragility of the pedestal she'd been placed on. For the first time, I saw her not as the golden child, but as someone just as trapped by our parents' expectations as I had been. Her frustration reached a peak when she tried to confront me in person. One afternoon, she showed up at my door unannounced, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the living room. Ethan, who had been working in his home office, emerged to find us mid-confrontation. He stood quietly in the doorway, his presence a silent reassurance as Hannah launched into her tirade. "Do you even realize what you've done?" she demanded, pacing the room. "You've ruined everything! Mom and Dad are devastated and now the family is turning against us. How could you be so selfish?" I let her vent, waiting until she paused for breath before responding. "Hannah, this isn't about me," I said, my voice steady. "This is about the way Mom and Dad have treated people for years. Their favoritism didn't just hurt me, it hurt the entire family. If you can't see that, then maybe it's time you take a step back and look at the bigger picture." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "The bigger picture? The bigger picture is that you've always been jealous of me, and now you're trying to punish me for their choices." "That's not fair, Leah." Ethan stepped in then, his voice calm but firm. "Hannah, this isn't about punishment or jealousy. It's about accountability. Your parents made their choices, and now they're dealing with the consequences. Leah isn't responsible for that, and neither are you. But if you keep blaming her, you're only going to push her further away." Hannah stared at him, momentarily at a loss for words. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out, Slamming the door behind her, Ethan and I stood in silence for a moment before he wrapped his arms around me. "You handled that well," he said softly. The confrontation left me shaken, but resolute. For too long, I had let my family's dynamics dictate my self-worth. Now I was finally reclaiming my voice, even if it meant enduring moments like this. The week of Hannah's wedding, my parents made one last attempt to mend their reputation, or at least their version of it. They sent out a formal letter to the family, accusing me of spreading lies and urging everyone to put the past behind them for Hannah's sake. The letter was met with mixed reactions. Some relatives rolled their eyes, others forwarded it to me with messages of support, and a few even called my parents out directly for their behavior. Hannah's wedding day arrived, and I stayed home. Ethan and I spent the day hiking in a nearby national park, enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. I didn't feel the need to check social media or ask anyone for updates. Whatever happened at that wedding was no longer my concern. Later that evening, I received a text from Aunt Clara. It was a beautiful wedding, but the energy felt off. So many people were missing, and your parents looked strained. I think they're starting to realize the consequences of their actions. I'm proud of you, Leah. You've handled this with grace. Her words brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's dynamics, constantly questioning if I was the problem. Now, I saw things clearly. Their favoritism, their manipulation, their inability to acknowledge my worth, it was all on them. And while I couldn't change the past, I could choose to let it go. Ethan and I ended the day sitting by the fire, reflecting on how far we'd come. "You've built something beautiful here," he said, gesturing to our home and the life we'd created together. "And you did it on your own terms. That's something to be proud of." For the first time in a long time, I believed him. The divide in the family reached its peak as Hannah's wedding day loomed closer. My parents' desperate attempts to repair their image only worsened the situation. Their lengthy email pleading for attendance was met with silence from most of the family. A few relatives confided in me that they were disgusted by how my parents and Hannah had treated me. "It's not about the wedding anymore," my Aunt Clara explained during a phone call. "It's about years of favoritism and hurt." On the day of Hannah's wedding, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Despite everything, I didn't wish for her day to fail. Yet, I also felt a sense of vindication, knowing that my parents and sister could no longer hide behind their perfect facade. Ethan and I spent the day away from the drama, opting for a quiet outing in the countryside. As we strolled through the trails, I reflected on how much I had grown. For the first time in my life, I felt free from the weight of seeking their approval. Later that evening, I received a flurry of updates from family members who had attended the wedding. "It was awkward," one cousin texted me. "You could feel the tension in the air." Others described how my parents seemed strained, their smiles forced as they greeted guests. Hannah, despite her lavish celebration, didn't seem as radiant as one might expect a bride to be. "It was beautiful," Aunt Clara said, "but it lacked heart." A few days after the wedding, I received an unexpected call from Hannah. Her tone was different, less accusatory and more subdued. "Leah," she began hesitantly, "I think we need to talk." I agreed, though cautiously. We met at a cafe later that week, both unsure of how to start the conversation. "I want to apologize," she said finally, her voice trembling, "for everything, for how I've treated you, for the things I said, and for not being there for your wedding." Her words caught me off guard. For so long, I had seen her as the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Hearing her admit fault was both surprising and validating. "I've been thinking a lot since the wedding," she continued. "It wasn't what I expected. I thought having everything perfect would make me happy, but it didn't. And seeing how many people supported you, even from a distance, made me realize something. Maybe I've been so focused on being mom and dad's favorite that I forgot how to be a good sister." Her honesty disarmed me. For the first time, it felt like we were speaking as equals, not as competitors vying for our parents' attention. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means a lot. I've been hurt, Hannah. For years, I felt like I wasn't enough, for them or for you. But I don't want us to keep hurting each other." We talked for hours, delving into memories, misunderstandings, and moments of pain. By the end of it, I felt a glimmer of hope. While I knew it would take time to rebuild trust, this conversation was a step in the right direction. As for my parents, they remained distant. My mother occasionally sent passive-aggressive messages about how I had tarnished the family's reputation, but I no longer felt the need to engage. My father stayed silent, his disapproval evident in his lack of communication. For now, I decided to let them be. I had spent too much of my life trying to mend a relationship that only brought me pain. If they wanted to reconcile, they would need to meet me halfway. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Hannah and I started rebuilding our relationship, cautiously but genuinely. We met occasionally for coffee or lunch, focusing on finding common ground rather than rehashing old wounds. She even expressed interest in getting to know Ethan better, something that felt like a small victory. Meanwhile, Ethan and I thrived in our own bubble of love and support. We planned weekend getaways, started a small garden in our backyard, and dreamed about the future. His unwavering belief in me became the foundation of my healing. "You've come so far," he said one evening as we sat on our porch, watching the sunset. "I'm proud of you." Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the pain of my upbringing had shaped me, but didn't define me. I had learned to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, and to prioritize the people who truly cared about me. While my parents' favoritism had left scars, it had also taught me the value of self-worth. I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. One day, I received an unexpected letter from my father. It was brief, almost formal, but it acknowledged the pain he had caused. "I'm not good at expressing emotions," he wrote, "but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I've made mistakes, and I hope we can find a way to move forward." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. I wrote back, cautiously opening the door to further communication. As the years went on, the family dynamics continued to shift. Some relationships mended, while others faded into the background. Through it all, I held on to the lessons I had learned, that love should be unconditional, that boundaries are essential, and that my worth is not determined by anyone else's validation. In the end, I found peace, not in the approval of my parents or the resolution of every conflict, but in the life Ethan and I built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was more than enough.